Now, it's one of the highlights of my week to introduce Rachel Blevins. Remember her name. She's even got a blue tick now on Twitter. I tell you, this young woman is going places. The White House, I hope. Rachel, thank you for joining us. Let me ask you about that question first. Tell us, how spectacular is the collapse of the Russiagate hoax?
My goodness, I feel like we've been talking about Russiagate for years and years now because we literally have. And you're absolutely right. I mean, you have to go back and look at the media coverage and how sensational it was. I mean, talk about 2015, 2016, when this Steele dossier came to light. The claims were so outrageous that there were plenty of people who thought, well, there's no way this could be true. It turns out it wasn't true. But I mean, just the claim that Donald Trump of all people, was some sort of Russian agent, the fact that people in the mainstream media, like Rachel Maddow, literally ran with this and acted as if it was fact, didn't question it, just immediately sold it to their viewers, and that it became this claim that Russia had hacked our elections, that Russia had interfered in U.S. politics. It was kind of one of those cases of you repeat it enough times and then it becomes the truth. And that was how a number of people here in this country accepted it. And even when those stories start to fall apart, you don't get the corrections then, right? You don't get the media organizations coming out saying, hey, our bad, we were wrong, we didn't do the basic aspects of journalist integrity when we were covering this story. And instead, you get them kind of shrugging it off and moving on to the next sensationalized part of it, and not at all vowing to do better next time around, because on their end, they got those millions of hits. They got the money, the advertising dollars, everything that went into it. They have no remorse for the fact that it wasn't true. They have no remorse for how it would have changed our politics if they hadn't covered it. And, you know, it is interesting that we're now finding out about this, and the reaction from the media seems to be just kind of, all right, let's move on, another day, another story, so to speak.
Yeah, the Washington Post have at least flagged up that the indictment against Steele's chief witness brought by the FBI on the fact that he lied to them, that all the stories that he told them were made up, that none of the sources he claimed he had actually existed. This is devastating, or ought to be, to any journalist of integrity. At least the Post has said this casts doubt on our previous reportage of this matter, and cast doubt it certainly does. But Maddow made a career and many millions of dollars in salary in her extended contract out of breaking down and crying tears on TV live on MSNBC, as she became the chief tribune of the lie that Russia was running President Trump as an agent. She said nothing.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly how it goes. I mean, you also have to remember Rachel Maddow was the same one who sat there and told her viewers that Russia was going to turn off the U.S. power grid in the middle of winter and leave us all to freeze and die, and then never really followed up on that one either. But yes, exactly. It's the accountability of those talking heads. And, you know, when you look at what actually happened, especially when it comes to the 2016 election, the reason that Hillary Clinton did not win was because of Hillary Clinton in large part. You know, you had someone like Donald Trump who tried to, you know, transition himself and make it look like he was anti-establishment. And he went and he had campaign rallies across the country in towns and cities that Hillary Clinton would never, ever go to. You know, he talked to the average American. He made them feel like he was in their corner. That's why he gained so much support. But then you have Hillary Clinton over here saying, oh, well, Trump could only have run because he was a Russian agent and Russia interfered because there were claims that, you know, you had different Russian troll farms buying ads on Facebook. I mean, it is so ridiculous that the story itself would have had to fall apart. Now it is falling apart, but I mean, it's just crazy to think of how scandalous all of this was, and the fact that the actual major players in it, has been no sort of accountability for them. Especially you look at the fact that the FBI is now looking pretty ridiculous because their top witness, it turns out he lied about everything he said. I mean, I think this is one of those cases where all of those bricks are going to continue to fall as we go along.
Yeah, it had serious consequences. I mean, it was a hoax like the WMD hoax that fooled the world into agreeing to or those that did agree to invade and occupy Iraq with catastrophic results. The Russiagate hoax also had consequences. For a start, it made Trump, maybe he would have done it anyway, because as you rightly say, he was posing as a man of the people, the blue-collar champion, the anti-establishment figure, even though he was a creature of the New York City lagoon. He was able to do that, and he might or might not have done the things that he promised he would do in the election campaign of 2016. He was forced to abandon those things and, in fact, take the opposite course just to prove that he was not a Russian agent. He levied more sanctions on Russia than anyone had ever done. He confronted Russia militarily than in a way that nobody had ever done before. His anti-Russian policy was the opposite of what he claimed it was going to be in the election, all because of the hoax. He also continued the wars that he said he was going to withdraw from to prove that he wasn't a Russian agent. So these lies, this hoax, had very serious consequences.
Oh, absolutely. And you make excellent points there. And I think it is interesting how they kind of backed him into a corner to say, well, anything you do is going to be looked at through the lens of what would Russia think? What would Putin think? Would he approve of this? Because that's exactly how it was portrayed by so much of the media. And the only times that they really wanted to praise Donald Trump was when he was bombing Syria. That's when they said that he actually looked presidential. And yet at the same time, when it came to, as you mentioned, his claims that he was going to end those endless wars, well, when he wanted to pull back on troops, then the question became, well, what would Russia think? How much would Russian influence increase in the Middle East if the U.S. pulls out, if they don't do exactly as they have been doing for the last 2 decades? And it's almost for all of those in the U.S. establishment that are looking at like someone like Donald Trump coming into the White House, it's almost brilliant on their end because they back him into a corner and they say, look, you ran on these promises. You're not going to be able to fulfill any of these promises because we have the ultimate checkmate of being able to say that you're a Russian agent and go after you for that, even when at the end of the day, it is their bluff that they are calling essentially.
Do the people in America know that this was all made in Britain? In fact, made through the wall next door to me?
Next door to you. Yeah. I would say ultimately no. The average American has kind of moved on and they have either they're in the camp of buying the claims of Russiagate and they don't really care about it anymore. And they've just assumed that that's how, elections are run here, even though I would think that if you really did think that Russia had a hand in deciding our election in 2016, that you would be calling to make sure that they are much more secure moving into future elections. But at the end of the day, I think it's one of those issues where people either have decided that they believe it or they don't believe it, and they've kind of moved on to a certain extent. So, there's not a lot of talk about how, people in the UK could be involved or even how this is going to play out if they think, it's like it was one of those things where we saw back in 2020 with that election where all of a sudden you had U.S. intelligence agencies coming out and saying there was no interference, everything was secure. And it's like, well, wait a second, y'all just spent the last 4 years selling us that this election was completely interfered with by Russia. And now all of a sudden, 2 days after the 2020 election, you're saying that everything's fine. I mean, I do not know how the American people can buy it, but a large number of them do.
Not in Virginia. They had an election this week, and it turns out that there are a basket of deplorables in the great state of Virginia, and they could only have rejected this other creature of the Clinton lagoon, Terry McAuliffe. They could only have rejected him because they're all deplorable, racist, sexist, misogynist, every ism that the Democrats can muster. That's not a great plan for the midterms, calling the voters all these bad names.
Exactly. You would think that they would have learned that by now. You know, what's really interesting about Virginia is that this was a state where Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic candidate, he tried to paint the Republican candidate as an extension of Donald Trump. And he ran at it by saying, "You're electing Trump, you're electing Trump." He was so focused on that he wasn't focused on the actual issues. And that's what the people of Virginia wanted to focus on. And, you know, to his point, Glenn Youngkin actually went in there. He focused on the issues. He didn't even try to necessarily tie himself to Trump and say, "Oh, I'm Trump's buddy." But what he did was he focused on the issues that people wanted to talk about. He focused on, you know, a big one was education. And you have families across this country that have had to have their kids on virtual school for so much of the last year. Now they're finally going back to school and they're worried about the state of education. And so he went in there and he said, "Hey, I want the parents to be more involved in their children's education. I want them to have more of a say." And that got people to get out and vote. And so I think that, you know, Democrats could, not that they will, but they could learn an important lesson from this election, which is that they are going to have to run on more than just anti-Trump policies, especially, and this is going to be tricky for them now that they've had, you know, the Democratic majority in the House, in the Senate, and in the White House, and we've seen how much they've actually gotten done with that. But they are going to have to find a path that is not just anti-Trump, whereas Republicans are kind of learning that they can look more on their policies, not just look at Trump, because that was one of the things that Youngkin did that he did well, was that he tried to kind of cater to both sectors of the GOP, both those who are frustrated with the election outcome and those who want to move on from it. And he catered to that in a way that a lot of Republicans could learn from moving forward.
Now, lastly, and I tread delicately into this because I don't know the woman, but I watched Nancy Pelosi at the podium this week. And I mean, we've gotten used to Joe Biden letting off, trumping in front of royals in Glasgow and so on. We've gotten used to him looking like he's lost. But when I watched Nancy Pelosi, I didn't know if she was drunk or unwell. What's wrong with that woman?
I was going to say, how much time do you have here? You know, Nancy Pelosi, I mean, she is the perfect example of why we need term limits in this country, because this woman has literally been in Congress longer than I've been alive. And she is, I mean, she's third in line to the presidency. You think about the fact that if Joe Biden passes away tomorrow and then Kamala Harris does, we have Nancy Pelosi. Like, she is our president. It is crazy to me that they have continued to allow this woman to be House Speaker, because you're right. She gets up there. She gives these ridiculous speeches that are all over the place. And it really makes you wonder, why has this woman not retired? With someone with her kind of wealth and with the millions of dollars in wealth that she has, you would think that she would want to go retire on an island somewhere, you know, enjoy her life, enjoy her grandkids. I don't know why these are the top leaders of our country, but I can imagine that to a number of other countries in the world, it looks pretty ridiculous. And trust me, it looks just as ridiculous here at home.
Thank you very much, as always, Rachel Blevins, for joining us.